Hi, this is Representative Porter. Okay, you ready? What'd you say?
They're doing a countdown on the back end of the website, so as soon as that clock hits 0, you can go ahead.
I can go ahead, okay.
There you go.
The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 3 public lands bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help keep members to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3L and the latest guidance from the attending physician, anyone present in the hearing room today must wear a mask covering their nose and mouth if they are not fully vaccinated or if they are uncomfortable with informing us of their vaccination status. It is my hope that with everyone's cooperation, we can protect the safety of members and staff and the witnesses and the families they return to at home. The committee has masks available for anyone who needs one. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Thank you for joining us all at today's subcommittee on the National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands hearing. Last week, House leadership announced a small change to this week's voting schedule, so Chair Neguse is unable to attend today's hearing. I am happy to be here as a committee member in his absence and would like to extend gratitude to my colleagues who have sponsored these bills, as well as today's witnesses, for their time and their thoughtful testimony. Today, we'll be reviewing 3 important bills that may not seem obviously connected. However, they are all designed to help protect and preserve our shared story in their own unique ways. First, we have H.R. 1117 from Representative Desaulniers. This bill authorizes the expansion of the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park in Richmond, California. This partnership park tells the story of the Americans who banded together and worked to support the war effort in boomtowns like Richmond and throughout the country. The proposed expansion allows the National Park Service to acquire sites like the Nystrom Elementary School, which would be the first public education facility within the boundaries of the park. Today, we are scheduled to hear more about the ongoing preservation efforts at the park from Betty Reed Sorkin. At the impressive age of 100, Ms. Sorkin is the oldest active National Park Ranger and a woman who herself worked on the home front during World War II. She has worked as a park ranger for nearly 20 years, dedicated to sharing her story and that of other Black women who made important and sometimes forgotten contributions during the World War II era. Not everyone knows that the integration of the workforce that occurred during World War II was an important precursor to the civil rights movements that followed, and I'm eager to hear more about her perspective and how this bill will contribute to the park's founding mission and objectives. Unfortunately, Ms. Suskin is unable to attend today, but we will hear from the mayor of Richmond about the importance of the park and why the residents of his city support the proposed expansion outlined in H.R. 1117. We will also be discussing H.R. 3525 from Representative Meng. Representative Meng is the vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and her bill would establish a commission to examine the establishment of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture. The Asian American experience is woven into the fabric of this country, and creating a commission is the first step in creating a museum designed to tell this story and ensure that Americans of all ethnicities and generations have the opportunity to learn about our nation's values, traditions, culture, and history. This is very important and very true in Orange County, where I'm from. Orange County is home to the third largest Asian American population in the country. They are our colleagues, our neighbors, and our friends, and we understand better than anyone the rich contributions of Asian Americans to our country. The commission model worked well for the Women's History and American Latino Museum, both of which were recently established by Congress, and I'm proud to support Representative Meng's bill. The final bill on today's docket is H.R. 5230 from Representative Katko of New York. This bill authorizes the Secretary of Homeland Security to provide the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum with a one-time grant to support its operation and security needs. This committee recognizes the importance of this memorial and previously authorized a grant program administered by the Interior Department, which provided the museum with approximately $2 million last year. I look forward to learning more about the continuing management challenges and the need for ongoing federal support. Public lands tell our stories, and it is critical that they tell the story of all Americans. While they might not be strictly related to federally managed sites, these three bills advance that critical goal in their own unique ways. Again, I want to thank my colleagues and all of the witnesses for being here with us today. With that, I would like to turn it over to Ranking Member Rosendale for his remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it, and appreciate everyone joining us today. Today, the subcommittee meets to discuss three proposals related to national parks and museums for our last hearing of 2021. While each of these proposals is worthy of committee consideration, I find the timing and composition of this hearing highly questionable. As the prices of everyday household goods continue to increase and supply chains threaten our economy, and even Christmas, I fail to understand why our Democrat colleagues are focused on bills to create a new Smithsonian and expand an existing park unit that are completely unrelated to addressing the pressing problems Americans are facing. Due to President Biden's overregulation and overspending, Americans are not only worried about what's going to be under the tree this year, but whether they'll even be able to find a tree at all. Inflation is rising at the highest rate in over 30 years, with gas prices over 50% higher than last year and food prices 5% higher. The backlog of ships waiting to unload cargo off the coast of California reached a record 114 vessels last month, compared to a historic backlog of just 17 ships prior to the pandemic. Main Street businesses all across Montana are hanging help wanted signs in their windows during a devastating labor crisis, which will only be exacerbated by President Biden's recent vaccine mandate. That's why later this week, committee Republicans will be hosting our own forum to address the issues affecting the pocketbooks of millions of American families ahead of the holiday season. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle appear okay with ending this year on a whimper. But Republicans are full steam ahead to make sure we're doing everything we can to serve the American people. With that being said, there is one bill that I'd like to highlight that is worthy of our time today, which is the National September 11th Memorial and Museum Act, sponsored by Representative Katko of New York. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the attacks on September 11th. The 9/11 Memorial Museum, located in New York City, is the principal tribute of remembrance and honor to nearly 3,000 people that were killed in the terror attacks at the World Trade Center and in Pennsylvania, as well as the 6 folks that were killed in the World Trade Center bombing in February of 1993. Unfortunately, the pandemic has financially devastating for the museum, which has suffered a 95% revenue loss in 2020. Representative Katko's bill provides a one-time grant ranging between $5 to $10 million from the Department of Homeland Security to help the 9/11 Memorial and Museum with its high security costs, which have not gone away during the pandemic. We're privileged to have Ms. Deborah Burlingame with us today. Ms. Burlingame is the sister of Captain Charles Chick Burlingame III, pilot of American Airlines Flight 77, which was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. Chick was a 25-year veteran of the Navy who honorably served his country until his final moments. As Ms. Burlingame stated in her written testimony, no reflection about 9/11 and the nation's response to that day is complete without recognition of the commitment, accomplishments, and heroic sacrifices of our military. Whether in the mountains of Afghanistan or the sands of Iraq, they have refused to flinch in the face of a brutal enemy. In light of the Biden administration's disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan earlier this summer, I believe consideration of this bill is more appropriate than ever to remind folks of why we were there in the first place and why we will never forget the courageous sacrifices made by our military members and their families. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing here today. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills that they have sponsored. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use stage view or grid view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before there's any questioning of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Chair Porter. Thank you to the ranking member for having this hearing. It's a pleasure to be here to present the Rosie, the Riveter National Historic Site Expansion Act, an act that I am supported and have a partner in the Senate with my good friend Alex Padilla. Also want to just thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity, I think, for Americans to remember a time when we came together for the common good. I want to thank you for mentioning Betty Reed Suskin, a wonderful friend, and I know she's very sorry she's not able to be here. Really a remarkable American. Also thank Mayor Tom Butt, another friend who's the mayor of the city of Richmond and has served in that capacity since 2015 and has been on the city council in Richmond since 1995. He also serves on the board of the Rosie the Riveter Trust, the official nonprofit partner of the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historic Park, and was instrumental in establishing Richmond's partnership position with the park. Mayor Butt's experience as an architect and advocate for historic preservation in Richmond make him an exceptionally qualified speaker here today. The bipartisan, bicameral Rosie the Riveter National Historic Site Expansion Act would add the Nystrom Elementary School in Richmond, California, to the existing Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, located in the district I have the pleasure of representing in California. Congressional approval of this addition and any other historical relevant sites is required by law that created this historical park. The park is unique in many ways, but it's unique because the sites are not concentrated in one place, but instead are spread out across the city of Richmond. These historic resources, owned by various public and private entities, collectively help tell the story of America's World War II homefront efforts on the Pacific coast. The sites are easily accessible to the public by this beautiful San Francisco Bay Trail and the Richmond Ferry Terminal. The elementary school, constructed in 1943, sits just north of the current park boundaries. The school is built to accommodate the large number of workers and their families that moved to Richmond to work at the Kaiser shipyards, a total of 55 war industries, transforming Richmond into a boomtown and overwhelming at that time the available schools and other community services. These workers included the thousands of women who migrated to Richmond from across the nation to serve in the war industry jobs and later became known by the popular moniker Rosie the Riveter. The surge of the area also included minority men and women. The integration of women and minority workers opened the door to equal rights and would later have profound impacts on the civil rights and women's rights movements. The elementary school listed in the National Registry of Historic Places in 2017 is a prime example of the assistance provided by the federal government during World War II to meet the need for local public services and the development of Richmond's infrastructure to support home front efforts. The elementary school was built as part of a planned development that includes the Maritime Child Development Center, which has already been preserved as part of the park. Due to its proximity to the shipyards and worker housing, the elementary school served the highest population of students within the Richmond School District during World War II. It is also significantly a fully integrated school, which was extremely rare at its time. By expanding the park to include this culturally significant site, visitors will have the opportunity to learn about the elementary school and better understand the social changes accelerated by the influx of thousands of workers and their families to Richmond. Having the elementary school identified as one of the park sites will help the Park Service interpret and share this history with visitors. The communities of Richmond and West Contra Costa played a pivotal role in our nation's efforts in World War II. We owe it to their families and a history to continue to write the history of the home front to share their stories. In addition to Mayor Budd, I would like to thank again Betty Reed Soskin, a dear friend, Richmond resident, and an unmatched advocate for preserving our local community's rich history, for her support of these efforts. Madam Chair, finally, I would like to enter into the record a map of the historical park reflecting the addition of the elementary school and a letter in support of the addition of the school to the park's boundaries from the West Contra Costa County Unified School District Superintendent to the National Park Service. Thank you again, Madam Chair. I want to thank the committee for its consideration of this legislation and the opportunity to offer testimony. I support the committee's continued bipartisan work to ensure to better protect the nation's public lands and treasured history of the American people, and I welcome any questions. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Desaulnier. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Meng.
Chair Porter, Ranking Member Rosendale, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss my bill, H.R. 3525, the Commission to Study the Potential Creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture Act. I would like to acknowledge the witnesses, Dr. Theodora Gonzalez, Ms. Lisa Ling, and Dr. Russell Jung for their time and testimony today. I also want to recognize my colleagues, Representatives Desaulnier and Representative Kako, and encourage the movement of all our bills through this hearing. I come before you today to emphasize why we should establish a national museum dedicated to AAPI history and culture in our nation's capital. Museums are gateways for Americans and the world to see our country's rich history, the challenges we overcame, and our potential for greatness. They offer space to reflect on the past, present, and future, a collage of all that has transpired and all that we continue to fight for. Indeed, a physical space located in the nation's capital is a powerful image that can inspire our youngest to pursue their dreams while educating visitors on our history. AAPI history is long and storied, and a national museum dedicated to it is overdue. As long ago as the 1700s, AAPIs have shaped the fabric of our country with contributions to our infrastructure, economy, selfless military service, and so much more. But too often, our community is excluded or forgotten in history, our American history. Chinese Americans fought for the Union at the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg during the American Civil War, and Japanese Americans comprised the 442nd Regimental Combat Team during World War II, which became the most decorated unit in the history of the U.S. military. While Chinese and Japanese Americans have demonstrated valor and bravery, they have also faced institutionalized disenfranchisement that manifested in U.S. laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and Executive Order 9066 that ordered the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Yet, from the first wave of Southeast Asian refugees on our shores to the Filipino Americans who helped found the farm worker labor movement, AAPIs have left an indelible mark on our American story. From these halls of Congress to every American classroom, our AAPI heroes, such as Grace Lee Boggs, a human rights activist for 7 decades, Larry Itliong, the quintessential leader for labor rights and justice, Dalip Singh Song, the first Asian American elected to Congress, and Patsy Mink, the first woman of color elected to Congress, and the original champion of the Title IX protections in the Higher Education Act, have fought for human and civil rights and social justice with their every breath. Shamefully, their stories are starkly missing from the narrative of American history. Chair Porter, Ranking Member Rosendale, this commission to study the creation of a National Museum of APA history is the first step in elevating AAPI experiences. Our stories provide an opportunity for us to celebrate our rich American history, remember the challenges we've overcome, and step forward in unity. Thank you again for this opportunity to come before your subcommittee. I ardently hope we can work together to preserve the unique histories of all Americans, including AAPIs, for future generations. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Meng. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Chairwoman Porter and Ranking Member Rosendale, for allowing me to testify today on H.R. 5230, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum Act. 20 years after the horrific September 11th attacks, it's important that we don't let them become a relic of the past. More than 70 million Americans have been born since the attacks. Let me repeat that. More than 70 million Americans have no memory of the day that forever changed this country and even the world. As the 9/11 Commission cited in their report, we as a country can never again suffer from a failure of imagination in how we think about the security of our homeland. However, as time passes and we get further away from the attacks, we risk forgetting the lessons that we so painfully learned that day. As was said by George Santayana, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum is truly a fitting tribute, honoring the lives of the 2,983 people killed in the September 11th, 2001 terror attack at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and on Flight 93, as well as the 6 people killed in the World Trade Center bombing on February 26 of 1993. More than 51 million people have visited the Memorial and Museum since it opened in 2011. It's truly a spectacular place. This includes visitors from all 50 states and more than 170 countries around the world, including more than 100 heads of state and 300 members of Congress. As one of its primary missions, the Memorial and Museum works to educate present and future generations about the attacks. I see this as maybe the most vital part of their mission. Unfortunately, the 9/11 Memorial Museum has not been immune to the economic hardships experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, the 9/11 Memorial Museum had to close its doors for 6 months. Even once it was able to reopen, the 9/11 Memorial Museum could not accommodate the same number of visitors it had in the past. As a result, it is experiencing a significant shortfall in funding to keep the memorial and museum open to the public. One of the largest expenses the museum incurs month after month is for security for the grounds. Whether the museum is open or closed, those expenses accrue. The bill introduced along with Chairman Benny Thompson will support the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, a nonprofit organization, by providing it funding to ensure that the grounds and facilities can remain open safely and allow space for visitors to remember and honor everyone touched by that fateful day. Specifically, this bill requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to provide a one-time grant to the 9/11 Memorial Museum for the operation, security, and maintenance of its facilities and grounds in New York City, once the Secretary has determined that the 9/11 Memorial Museum meets certain criteria. The bill currently has 40 additional co-sponsors. Within 90 days after enactment, the bill requires a report to Congress on how the 9/11 Memorial and Museum spent the grant funding. As a nation, I believe that we owe it to both those that lived through the attacks and those who were not even born to preserve the memory of the people who made the ultimate sacrifice and to remember and build on the lessons we learned. So again, Ms. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for holding this legislative hearing. I appreciate the opportunity you gave me to talk about my bill and the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. And I'll note that one of the directors of the museum is here with us today, and I just want to recognize him as well as the others that are going to speak after me. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Katko. I thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony. We are now going to transition to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before it is any questioning of the witnesses. Before introducing our witnesses, I will remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. The chair will now recognize Mayor Tom Butt from Richmond, California.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify before you today, fittingly on the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into World War II. My name is Tom Butt. I'm mayor of Richmond, California, home of the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park. And I'm here to talk about H.R. 1117, the Rosie the Riveter National Historic Site Expansion Act, which would add the World War II era Nystrom Elementary School to the current inventory of park sites. I'm substituting today for my good friend Betty Reed Sorkin, who at over 100 years old is the oldest ranger in the National Park Service. I'm sorry she was not able to be with us today. I'm also the founding member of the Rosie the Riveter Trust, the official nonprofit partner of Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, and I currently serve on the board of directors. Along with two Rosies, who are now deceased, I testified in front of this very same committee 22 years ago when legislation establishing the park was being considered. It was signed into law by President Clinton in the year 2000. In 2010, the park completed its general management plan, which outlined a process for addition of sites to the park. A willing property owner who wishes their site to be included as part of the park can request inclusion and evaluation. The first step in this process is to have the structure listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which happened to Nystrom School in 2017, and a determination of significance to the World War II Homefront and how its story is told. West Contra Costa Unified School District rehabilitated Nystrom Elementary according to the Secretary of Interior standards for historic preservation. Nystrom Elementary School, a K-5 elementary school within the West Contra Costa Unified School District, is an original structure built during World War II to accommodate the large number of families that moved to Richmond to work in the Kaiser shipyards. Incidentally, the school was fully racially integrated, which is indicative of the societal transformation that took place in Richmond during the war years. These families played a critical role in the successful mobilization of people and resources for the World War II Homefront to ultimately win the war. It is vital that we add this crucial site to Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park to showcase the important history of this community and to properly honor the service of all those who assisted in the war effort. The City of Richmond serves as one of the key partners for the park, as well as the owner of a number of other Rosie Riveter park sites, and strongly supports the inclusion of Nystrom Elementary School. Rosie the Riveter is a unique partnership park where the National Park Service does not own any of the properties that are named in the original enabling legislation, and the National Park Service has no legislated financial commitment to maintaining or restoring them. Adding Nystrom Elementary School would require no acquisition or operational costs. HR 1117 would allow for the future addition of other sites to the park which are similarly determined to be nationally significant in showcasing the World War II home front story in Richmond. Any nationally significant site added to the park would help advance the conservation of World War II era resources that help tell the park's stories and educate the public about this important time in our nation's history. Thank you for considering this legislation and for allowing me this time to speak before the committee. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Congressman Mark DeSaulnier for his heartfelt support and continuing dedication to preserving Richmond's World War II homefront history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Dr. Theo Gonzalez, Acting Director of the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center.
Thank you. Good morning. Chairperson Porter, Ranking Member Rosendale, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Dr. Theodore S. Gonzalez, and I have the honor of serving as the Interim Director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Prior to joining the Smithsonian, I worked for 26 years as a professor of Asian American and Ethnic Studies in the states of Hawaii, Maryland, and California. I considered it a great professional privilege to work at the world's largest museum, research, and education complex. Our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities are the fastest growing segment of the United States population, numbering approximately 24 million. We have stories that are in dire need of the telling, and the Smithsonian plays a crucial role in the telling of those stories. In 1997, the Smithsonian established our unit to document Asian American history, art, and culture. Our activities involve public programming, exhibitions, research, and developing collections. In 2022, the Asian American Pacific Center will celebrate its 25th anniversary of providing critical expertise in the sharing of these stories. The Asian Pacific American Center administers an initiatives pool. These are federally appropriated funds that support projects across the Smithsonian. These projects allow us to engage the public and researchers in dynamic programs. Since its inception 5 years ago, the initiatives pool has supported over 50 projects, including the creation of the first curator of Asian Pacific American history at the National Museum of American History. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today on H.R. 3525, a bill to establish a commission to study the potential creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American culture and history. If Congress deems it in the public interest to move forward with the creation of the commission, the Smithsonian and I stand ready to serve as content experts should the bill pass into public law. In the meanwhile, the Asian Pacific American Center will contribute to the Smithsonian's larger aim of telling inclusive stories about our shared pasts and our shared futures. For our 25th anniversary, the center looks forward to the following 5 things. 1, hosting a major literature festival in Washington, D.C. 2, commissioning several murals that celebrate Asian American communities throughout the United States. 3, continuing to collect objects that inspire and expand the general public's knowledge. 4, providing paid internships and fellowships to develop the next generation of museum professionals. And 5, creating the first dedicated Asian Pacific American exhibition gallery within the Smithsonian. In these remarks, I've been referencing persons and stories that seem abstract, but let me take a moment to make clear what often seems clouded. I could recite to you a long list of high achievers and medal winners, but more often than not, Asian American and Pacific Islander stories are about hard lives, hard-headed dreamers, and strivers. To paraphrase one of my favorite writers, Carlos Bolosan, if you want to know what we are factory hands, field hands, mill hands, searching, building. We are doctors, scientists, chemists, discovering and eliminating disease, hunger, and antagonism. We are soldiers, sailors, citizens, guarding the imperishable dream of our ancestors to live in freedom. We are the living dream of the dead. We are the living spirit of the free. I'd like to thank the committee for giving me this opportunity to testify today and for your support and interest in the work of the Smithsonian. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lisa Ling, journalist.
Good morning, Chair Porter, Ranking Member Rosendale, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Lisa Ling, executive producer and host of This Is Life on CNN and the new HBO Max series Takeout, which is a really fun but also highly emotional show about buried Asian American histories through the lens of food. When I think about my 10-year-old self, the one who grew up in a non-diverse suburb of Sacramento, who was teased and carried so much shame around being Asian, I could have never imagined that one day I'd be sitting before this esteemed committee advocating for a national museum that would highlight AAPI history and achievements. Frankly, the mere notion of such a facility in our nation's capital alongside other storied institutions truly gives me chills. After all, there are over 24 million AAPIs in the US, and according to a Pew study, it's the fastest growing demographic, expected to reach nearly 40 million by 2060. And although there is great diversity within our community, there are few institutions that honor the AAPI experience in totality. Asians have been in America before the United States was even the United States, as I learned while working on my show Takeout. The first men from Asia to settle here were crew or indentured servants who jumped off Spanish galleon ships in the 1700s and ended up in the bayous of Louisiana. They were an industrious group who built entire towns that would later get washed away by hurricanes, but they ran schools, operated businesses, and even had their own currency that I saw for myself, artifacts that I'm sure they'd love to donate to a national museum. In fact, in the town of Jean Lafitte, the current mayor, a blonde, blue-eyed descendant of one of those early Filipino settlers, believes that 70 to 80% of the population of his town has Filipino blood running through it. Asians built the most important construction project in mid-19th century America, the Transcontinental Railroad, which physically and symbolically linked this nation and led this country onto a path of prosperity. The state of California, my state, the sixth biggest economy on earth, wouldn't be what it is if it weren't for Chinese labor. They helped build the levees along the Sacramento Delta and planted much of the agriculture for which the state became known. But after being accused of taking away American jobs, the Chinese became targets of riots, arson, and lynching, and ultimately the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese haven't been the only Asian targets of violence here. During the Bellingham riots of the early 20th century, hundreds in Bellingham, Washington, pulled Indian lumber mill workers from their bunks, beat them, and set fire to their lodging. But through the many dark chapters of AAPI history come stories of honor. Some may know that during World War II, Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps by executive order. What you might not know is that during that time, young Japanese men were asked to volunteer to fight for U.S. armed forces. 18,000 of them became a fighting force known as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And fight they did. They would become the most decorated unit of their size in U.S. military history, earning over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, and an unprecedented 7 presidential unit citations. All the while, America was incarcerating many of their families. And yet, there is no mention of these American heroes in our history books. In fact, students might go their entire educational life without learning a single fact about Asian Pacific Americans. Not about the Supreme Court case of Wong Kim Ark that made birthright citizenship law, not about Dalip Singh Sund, who, after working to overturn a policy that prevented South Asians from naturalizing, became the first Asian American elected to Congress. Not about the reputed First Lady of Physics, Dr. Chin Chung Woo, who helped the US develop the atomic bomb. Not about Jawed Karim and Steve Chen, two of the Asian American founders of a little-known video sharing platform called YouTube. I am barely scratching the surface here, but according to a study conducted by Launch, when asked, when you think of prominent Asian Americans, what specific names come to mind? 42% of respondents said, I don't know, despite having a vice president who's Asian. 11% said Jackie Chan, who isn't even American. When the stories and histories of a people are excluded from a country's narrative, it becomes so easy to overlook and even dehumanize an entire population. And while the inclusion of this history would go a long way with the diaspora as vast and diverse as ours, it can't just be a chapter in a textbook. Ours are the stories of 24 million Americans, and we all deserve a place to take our children to see that Asian Pacific Americans are and have been an integral part of the fabric of this great nation that we all call home. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Congresswoman Meng, for introducing this bill.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ling. The chair now recognizes Dr. Russell Jung, Asian American Studies professor at San Francisco State University and co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate.
Chairperson Porter and honored members of this committee, I'm pleased to testify on behalf of Representative Grace Meng's bill, H.R. 3525, to study the creation of a National Museum for Asian Pacific American History and Culture. I'm professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State, as well as co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, a coalition of Chinese for Affirmative Action, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and Asian American Studies. As a scholar of Asian American Studies, I know that if our nation wants to live up to its ideals of equality and justice, then we need to acknowledge and then stop repeating our nation's history of racial exclusion. Tragically, our xenophobic history has repeated itself during this COVID-19 pandemic. In our latest report, this year, Stop AAPI Hate has documented over 10,000 self-reported incidents of hate from every state. The trends have been horrifying and consistent. Women report twice as much as men about harassment. Youth and elders are targeted in high proportions. We're being racially profiled for attacks. Even though China may blame China as the source of the disease, 57% of our respondents are non-Chinese. In almost half of our self-reported incidents, perpetrators employ anti-Chinese and nativist remarks, such as "go back to China, you effing chink." And our reports that we've received are just a fraction of the national trend. Our National Representative Survey recently found that 1 in 5 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced an incident of discrimination this past year. That's 5 million incidents of hate across the nation. Further, due to the racialization of COVID-19 as a quote-unquote Chinese virus, Asians have faced the brunt of exclusionary policies. Last year, we saw a ban on Chinese scientists, cuts to refugee resettlement and H-1B visas, and eventually even migration visas were suspended so that families couldn't reunite. Sadly, we've seen these racist attacks and exclusionary policies before. The yellow peril stereotype that Asians are perpetual foreigners who threaten the US has been invoked time and time again. As Lisa Ling said, in the 1870s, Chinese were portrayed as disease carriers and heathen coolies who stole white workers' jobs. So Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first legislation to exclude an entire ethnic group. At the same time, these fears of the yellow peril instigated and justified so much mob violence that over 200 Chinese settlements were mass displaced in that era. My own family, who settled in California in the 1860s, were driven out after a fire burned down their community of 200 residents. They had built a family, a small business that was thriving, a home, but they had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge. This pattern continued in 1920s at Angel Island. Because Chinese were seen as disease carriers and illegal, they had to undergo lengthy interrogations and dehumanizing medical checkups. 5% of Chinese never made it to San Francisco, but were deported back for arbitrary medical reasons. So these two historical examples of race and public health, from these two examples, you could see even my own family has had to deal with exclusion, mass displacement, segregation, detention, and deportation. We didn't have any specific genetic disease, but we faced these experiences solely because of Chinese, anti-Chinese racist policies. American history repeats itself in one last pattern, and that Asians have always fought back. And a National Museum of APA history and culture can serve to help Americans reflect on these histories and then also amplify how AAPIs have affected social change. Our government and its institutions must bring to light these systematic sources of racism in its varied forms, both the violence and exclusionary policies. We need to educate the public about the contribution of our community and to fight discrimination so that all Americans can learn lessons on how to pursue our shared value for justice. So thank you for inviting us today, and I hope that we Americans can rewrite the American story, one where AAPIs and others are included and treated with the dignity and respect that everyone deserves. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. The chair now recognizes Ms. Deborah Burlingame, board member of the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum.
Thank you, Chairman Porter, Ranking Member Rosendale, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify on H.R. 5230, the 9/11 Memorial Museum Act. And I'd like also to thank this committee for your support in the past, and to Representatives Nadler and Katko for your continued support and for providing testimony today. My name is Deborah Burlingame. I am a founding board member of the National September 11 Memorial Museum, and I am one of 10 9/11 family members who are greatly privileged to sit on that board. My brother, Charles F. Burlingame, Chick Burlingame, was the pilot in command of American Airlines Flight 77, the plane that was hijacked by 5 al-Qaeda terrorists and crashed into the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, killing 59 passengers and crew, including 5 young children and 125 people inside the Pentagon. Dozens more in the Pentagon who survived the attack were severely injured, some with lifelong burn injuries. I'd also like to thank Representative Rosendale for his very kind and moving remarks honoring my brother. I just would like to add that Chick, he was a Naval Academy graduate. He was a former fighter pilot in U.S. Navy. He served 25 years. He volunteered for the Gulf War, and he was distinctly aware of the potential danger of a terrorist suicide attack aimed at commercial airliners. And so it was heart-wrenching for us, his siblings, who he talked to about this very thing, to learn from the flight data recorder that he indeed fought them very hard. He knew what was at stake in defending his cockpit and to save the life of his passengers and crew. I would venture today that the 9/11 Memorial Museum's executive leadership, senior staff, and board of trustees are more sharply aware of potential security threats in what is now called the post-9/11 world than any other cultural institution in the United States. Indeed, we understand that we can never go back to September 10th because that would require a knowing the hard lessons of that day. We have dedicated our efforts over the last 20 years to learning, preserving, and teaching the history of 9/11 on behalf of all those who survived it, all those who witnessed it, all who were too young to remember it, and most importantly, those who were not yet born and their cohorts in future generations. This has truly been a daunting task, not simply because of the seriousness of the subject, the global nature and impact of the subject matter, but because we who lived through it will one day be gone. And so we are trustees not simply of the 9/11 Memorial, made of concrete, cascading water, and the names stenciled in bronze panels of beloved friends, family members, colleagues, and fellow human beings. We are trustees of history. The National September 11 Memorial Museum recently led the world in commemorating the 20th anniversary of the attacks on our nation. The annual ceremony was attended by more than 8,500 family members who were joined by 2 former U.S. presidents and the current president of the United States, the Speaker, Majority Leader, and numerous members of Congress and administration officials, all there to pay their respects. More than 60,000 people from all over the globe visited the 9/11 Memorial on just that one day to remember those who were killed and reflect on how far we've come. Since the memorial's opening 10 years ago, the Memorial and Museum has hosted over 53 million visitors from every state of the nation, more than 170 countries, more than 100 foreign leaders and heads of state, to learn about the attacks and what led up to them and how that continues to affect our world today. Like so many other cultural organizations, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum faced the unimaginable reality of having to close to the public in March of 2020 due to COVID-19. The 4 months of memorial closure and 6 months of museum closure created an unprecedented financial challenge as the primary source of our operating support, revenue generated by the museum admissions, collapsed entirely, with more than 95% of 2020 operating revenue lost as a result of COVID-19 protocols. To date, the Memorial Museum and Museum are only seeing approximately 30% of visitorship compared to 2019. I am very proud of our senior leadership that responded. They immediately implemented necessary budget cuts in March, further significant and difficult reductions in June, including a terrible decision, or a heartbreaking decision, to lay off and furlough nearly 60% of staff. It's almost 200 people. To achieve the budgetary reductions, senior managerial and executive staff, together with Board of Trustees, assessed all of the operational and programmatic areas, classifying them in various categories, what we could keep, what we couldn't keep, what should be suspended or simply reduced. The institution strove to maintain all core operational and programmatic commitments. Wherever possible, departments adapted activities and initiatives not conducive to producing the current pandemic environment, producing in the current pandemic environment by converting previously in-person events and programs to virtual offerings. And this actually enabled the institution to ensure that it was still serving its mission as well as engaging with key stakeholders, because it added the benefit of offering a reach to larger people geographically, more diverse audience in educational programming. And that's something that we'll keep when pandemic is over, we hope. The memorial reopened to the public on July 4th, 2020, the museum on September 11th, 2020. We developed a robust and comprehensive health and safety plan. It's regularly updated. It goes beyond the guidance of the CDC and government authorities. It's been an exemplary plan and a model for other institutions. For those unable to visit in 2020, the museum continued to offer and expand its virtual programming, online programs, virtual tours. We were able to offer interactive experiences for individuals, families, groups, and we launched virtual field trips for students in elementary age group, online professional programs, et cetera. Children born after 9/11 are now adults. And a full generation is in our workforce, our colleagues, our military is growing up in a world where the events of 9/11 impact their lives, but it is something that they learn from history. They didn't experience it and they don't know about it. This past anniversary, the Memorial and Museum was able to reach over 1,065,000 students and teachers in our annual webinar. And by the way, that's a wonderful figure for us because we started that in 2014. And in the years from 2014 through 2020, we were able to get almost 1 million. This figure here in one day, we reached as many students in all those years. So it's growing, and we have to thank the American Federation of Teachers for that. They helped us get access to these classrooms and these kids because they believe in the mission too. It's always important to remember that the 9/11 attack was not the first attack on that site. It was attacked in 1993, as Representative Katko mentioned. 6 people were killed. 1,000 were injured. The terrorists who did that were the same al-Qaeda terrorists who came back on September 11th. They intended to detonate they did intend to detonate and did detonate a 1,300-pound bomb that went through the 4 floors of the garage of the Tower 1. And their intention was to collapse that building and have it fall into Tower 2. So they came back. We've also had an attack after September 11th. That was on the West Side Highway when a man who was animated by ISIS videos rented a truck, ran it into tourists that were riding bikes on the West Side Highway bike path. He killed 8 people and injured 12, gravely injured 12. He's still in custody and will be put on trial for murder and attempted murder. He came down to that area specifically because it was ground zero, and he said so. That is exactly where all of the trucks, the fire trucks, ambulances connoitered in trying to rescue people that day, and they spent 9 months there on the West Side Highway.
Burlingame, you may finish your sentence or two, but your time is expired.
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to thank you for your time and consideration, and I want to know how deeply we all appreciate all this committee has done, all your colleagues have done in support of our organization, and we'll submit to questions now. Sorry for going over time.
No, thank you very much, Ms. Burlingame. I was very intently listening to you and did not even realize that time had gone so far
I wasn't paying attention
past.
either, I'm
So,
sorry.
No, absolutely. I appreciate your being here and just want to make sure that we have a chance to ask you questions and to hear from you and the other witnesses. We're now going to turn. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony. I want to remind members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions, and so the chair will now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask the witnesses. And I'm going to start by recognizing the gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Tlaib.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman, and thank you so much for all of the panelists for speaking. Many of you were incredibly inspiring. I want to, really bring this back to my district. I just had the chance to honor Clara Doutley on her 100th birthday. It's our own Detroit's own Rosie, the Riveter. And Ms. Doutley was raised in Detroit. She was the youngest of 6 siblings and attended Cass Technical High School. At 19 years old, she began working at Briggs Manufacturing, where she helped produce parts and components for the B-24 and B-29 bombers for World War II. And Ms. Doutley was one among 300,000 other women who worked as riveters assembling warplanes across Michigan during the 1940s. And we will owe so much to Clara and all the Rosies. And I'm thrilled that there's a national park that tells their story. Mayor Butt, you've been working to establish and expand the Rosie Riveter National Historic Sites for decades. Why is it so incredibly, why is it important to preserve the history and teach future generations about women like Clara Doutley?
Well, thank you for the question. There are so many stories from this era that are far beyond just making ships in Richmond. There were advances because of the war and because of the women and the minorities who came to work in the workforce. There were advances in childcare, education, as I said before, civil rights that are still enduring today. And these are the lessons that the Park Service tries to teach at Rosie the Riveter. And I think probably the most important lesson is how a country that was deeply divided in many ways came together for a single purpose, and that is to win World War II.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Mayor. And, you remind me of actually Pastor Bland in my district, Baptist pastor, reminded me sitting in his pew, kind of looked right at me and he said, our country's not divided, we're just disconnected. And I think so much of, what Congresswoman Meng, and thank you so much to Congresswoman Meng for her courage to want to tell the stories of so many of our Asian American neighbors across our country. But also, Congressman DeSaney, thank you so much for leading this fight to tell these stories. It is so important because I believe this in my heart that the only way to really fight back against hate or division is to talk about where we all came from and talk about our roots. It is so incredibly important. And as a girl from 85% Black cities, the most beautiful, Blackest city in the country. Every corner is a reminder of the struggle for civil rights, the continued struggle for so many of my Black neighbors. And it truly is inspiring. And as someone that continues to learn from many of, I call my Black mothers in the community, I know there's still so many stories to tell our children. So I can't thank you both, everyone that's pushing forward to be able to tell these important stories. Thank you so much. And I yield.
Thank you very much, Representative Tlaib. I now want to recognize Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. Ms. Burlingame, thank you for joining us today. The service and sacrifice your brother and family have committed to is admirable and tremendously appreciated. I completely agree with your written testimony that we need to recognize the heroic sacrifices of our military. And I'm proud to represent a state with the highest percentage of veterans in the nation. How does the 9/11 Memorial and Museum honor America's first responders and service members?
Thank you very much for that question, sir, and your remarks preceding it. The 9/11 Memorial Museum does a number of things. We have for years sponsored reenlistment ceremonies on the plaza. They like to come there on the plaza for reenlistment swearing in. And when that happens, there can be up to 100 people taking an oath to reenlist. They want to do it there because many of them enlisted in the first place because of 9/11. I know of a number of young people who were teenagers or even in elementary school, who watched the towers fall on television and swore that when they were old enough they were going to serve. I've come to become friends with so many people from the military community, those who served, those who were injured and need our help now. I know from talking to them that 9/11 is foremost in the background of their entire military experience. At the museum, 9/11 Memorial Museum, we honor them but with program materials. We recognize that there are 250 of the victims who died that day on 9/11 who served in the military, and on Veterans Day we put yellow roses on every single one of their names. That's done every year. We have Celebrating Service Day, where we have programs. It's always in heavy involvement with the military. And yes, there is a crossover between the FDNY, all of these fire services, police services. They're kind of cut from the same fabric. They want to serve their country and serve their communities. And so they're highly involved, and they're very involved in the museum itself. We actually have docents and volunteers who come from those communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This highlights the importance of the museum's mission. I really do believe that. Your written statement of the subcommittee, you discussed the impact of COVID on the museum and the memorial. Can you expand on how the lockdowns and restrictions affected the operations and the revenues? And has this hindered your ability to achieve your organization's vital mission?
Well, we lost 95% of our revenue in a matter of months. We rely on the admissions to support the museum. Yes, we get donations, but it's really the admissions that cover all our bills. And we have a security bill that is almost $1 million a month. That's a contract that we have to pay, and we gladly pay it. It's a big bill, but we have to pay it because, as I started mentioning in my overtime, our site is a place of great interest if people would do us harm, not just to that site, but to the country. It's become a symbol for them. And we have wonderful counterterrorism partners in the law enforcement community, NYPD, the Port Authority Police, Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York, and of course the FBI is always listening and watching. But we also have to have our own robust security, that we have 24/7 live cameras that are monitored by human beings 24/7, because even when the museum is closed and it's in the middle of the night on the plaza, that's sometimes when bad things happen. So we have to do that, and we have to do that whether we get 30% visitors or at 100%. Because the bad guys are going to come when they want to come. They come on their timetable, not ours. So that's a cost.
Thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in here before my time expires. I find it almost unbelievable how liberal politicians in New York, like Mayor de Blasio, have leveraged their positions to shut down businesses and stifle our economy. And you may have seen just yesterday, the mayor issued a rushed vaccine mandate that's going to go into effect in less than a month on any business with more than one person. I know you probably haven't had much time to think about it, yet alone plan for it. But how do you think that this is going to affect the museum and the memorial?
Well, I don't know that that will affect the museum and memorial any more than it already has. I mean, we're down 95% of revenue. That means he can only get, or these policies can only get 5% more. And so I know that the board is very committed. When this happened and we had to close, we knew that we had to reopen as soon as we could because we didn't want to go down, and the longer we were out, the harder it would be to rebuild back our audience. The board met. We decided unanimously to go out and raise money on our own. The board members all 100% donated and raised the funds. We raised $45 million, just the board.
I think we're out of time again. So, Ms. Burlingame, thank you so much. Thank you for commitment. And Madam Chair, I would yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosendale. Representative Nadler is now able to join us, and I ask for unanimous consent for him to be able to give his testimony as part of the member panel at this time. So ordered. So I'm now going to recognize Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes, and then we will return to questioning the witnesses.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for inviting me to testify regarding H.R. 5230, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum Act. I'm grateful to Homeland Security Committee Ranking Member Katko and Chairman Thompson for leading this important legislation. I was proud to join them in introducing this bill ahead of the 20th anniversary of the attacks on September 11th. We have endeavored as a nation to ensure that the 9/11 memorials continue to stand as places of reflection and remembrance for every American. Every generation should know the tragic events of that Tuesday morning and the heroism of those who rushed back to the burning Pentagon and onto the pile at Ground Zero to put out fires, search for survivors, clear debris, and rebuild for months and years. The National September 11th Memorial and Museum is a tribute of remembrance and honor to the nearly 2,983 people killed in the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001 at the World Trade Center site near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon, as well as the 6 people killed in the World Trade Center bombing in February 1993. Since its dedication in 2011, the 9/11 Memorial has welcomed more than 51 million visitors, including 9/11 victim family members, first responders, veterans, and the public from all 50 states and 190 countries. The memorial is a place of national and international significance for learning, grieving, and reflecting. Its collections, exhibits, and programming serve as powerful reminders of the largest loss of life resulting from a foreign attack on American soil and the greatest single loss of rescue personnel in American history. Like many nonprofit cultural institutions across the nation, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum has suffered substantial revenue loss because of pandemic-related closures and restrictions. Over 90% of the memorial and museum's operating budget comes from ticket sales. Ticket sales dropped nearly $45 million last year, and today the museum's attendance numbers are at only 30% of pre-pandemic numbers as COVID-19 has kept many Americans from traveling to New York. The revenue loss has threatened necessary programming and forced the museum to lay off a large number of staff members and close its doors to visitors twice a week. The revenue loss has also threatened the memorial and museum security budget. New York City, specifically the One World Trade building, remains a top target for terror threats. The fact that access to the memorial is free and available 7 days a week further emphasizes the importance of security funding for one of our nation's most solemn memorials. 20 years after the most significant terrorist attack in our nation's history, we must ensure that the memorial and museum can continue to serve as a solemn reflection that will continue to hold the memories of that day, those we lost, and how we rebuild. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum Act will provide critical funding to ensure the memorial and museum can safely remain open and accessible for visitors, despite the economic hardships it has experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. I urge the committee to support this vital piece of legislation. Again, I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify on this vital piece of legislation, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Representative Nadler, for your testimony. We are now going to return to questioning of the witnesses, and the chair will now recognize Representative Gohmert for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much and appreciate the witnesses. Ms. Burlingame, I really appreciate your testimony, and obviously New York City was the central target on 9/11, an appropriate place for a museum. You know, of course, the Pentagon was hit. We've got a federal holy site, basically, where those heroes brought the plane down in Pennsylvania, and no telling how many lives were saved there, especially if the target was actually the Capitol. But despite New York City being the central target, the biggest target, the largest loss of life, as you pointed out, losing 95% of the traffic through the museum is an indication of problem with Americans being able to enjoy and learn and revere the museum. Incredible that you could raise $45 million from just the board. And I realize there is a big shortfall, you need help, but it sounds like there are more potential shutdowns coming. You have one of the worst mayors in the country when it comes to dealing with problems. Law enforcement, he seems to have seen them as more adversarial than protective through much of his time as mayor. You talked about the need for proper security. It seems that having a museum in New York City under de Blasio puts you at more risk because of his approach to protection and law enforcement. As we've seen when you had law enforcement actually turn their backs on the mayor, something I had not ever seen before. So I'm wondering if New York City is going to continue to select a leader like that, if we're going to continue to see problems in the future getting Americans to the museum and learning more, as has been pointed out. You know, there's so many people alive today that were not alive on 9/11. They don't remember the way the entire country prayed for and was concerned for New York City and the Pentagon and those that were in the remaining flight in the air. So I'm just wondering if this, if by providing the millions needed for the 9/11 Museum in New York City, if it could end up just being the first drop in the bucket that's needed because of the leadership in New York City. Do we have any indications that New York City, I mean, obviously if New York City had the lowest COVID rate in the nation of any big city, then that would be encouraging, but that's not the case. So I'm just concerned that we may just have to continue to have taxpayers pay for the poor leadership in New York City in order to keep a museum going that very few people are going to be able to see anymore. So, Ms. Burlingame, I appreciate so much your efforts, but I'd like your views looking through as much of a crystal ball as you can for the future. Do you see any light for the future that's not an oncoming train in the form of a mayor like de Blasio?
Thank you, Representative Gohmert, for that question. That's a tricky question for me. I'm on a board of a private institution. We are not owned or operated by the government. We make our own decisions, and we have very little impact on the political life of the city. All we can do is serve the citizens, not only in New York, from all over the country who come to see this memorial and museum, and all over the world. There's a huge interest in this museum in the world. And I want to say two things. I hope I don't run out of time. One is the people who died, many of their remains are preserved underground, right on the site. We built this museum and memorial right on the site where they died. And we do not have the luxury of having conversations about politics. We have to focus on the mission of our museum. And part of that focus is not only raising the money to support it, but spending the money properly, especially on security. And, you know, we spent a lot of time after 9/11 trying to figure out how it happened, why it happened, what went wrong, what didn't we do that we could have done. I don't want there to come a day when, because we underfund the security of this place, that we have another atrocity on that site. And we had looking back and saying what we could have done, and shame on us for not doing it. 60,000 people came to that site on the 20th anniversary. Think of what an attraction that would be for people who wanted to do us harm. And I would also say, if I may, people come to the site not just to learn about 9/11. They not only learn about the terrible thing that happened that day. 9/11 is also a love story, a lot of heroism. I say it's a triumph of human decency over human depravity. That's evident everywhere you look in that museum. And that's evident in all the people who come. It's a beautiful place. There's no arguing there. There's no yelling. There's no shouting.
Right.
It's just quiet, peaceful, loving observance.
Thank you so much. My time's expired, and I realize you're a victim of the politics, not a mover in politics. Thanks for your efforts.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize herself for 5 minutes. Ms. Burlingame, my children were born after 9/11, and I just want to acknowledge what a meaningful experience it was for our family, and for them in particular, to be able to visit the museum and to ask questions and to engage thoughtfully about it. So thank you for your work in continuing to advocate for that, as you say, both tragic but also heroic time in our history. I want to turn to Mr. Gonzalez. I'm proud to represent Orange County. As I mentioned, it's home to the third largest Asian American population in the country. I formerly was a professor at UC Irvine, and I now represent it, and I know that you earned your PhD there. And we both know that the AAPI community is not a monolith, something that Ms. Ling also mentioned in her testimony. Given the diversity of all of the different groups and the relatively large geographic area and different moments of immigration, different moments of interaction with our country, of all these different groups that fall under the umbrella of Asian Pacific American, how would you recommend that the commission make sure that each of these communities are represented as the commission begins its work? Thank you for the question, Chair Porter, and go Anteaters. It's great to see a fellow Anteater in town. It's great that Professor Jung and I are on this panel, because he and I have shared a career in the academy where we've studied, as scholars of Asian American studies, we've really tried to grapple with this question. Asian American studies, I think studies is now a discipline that's about 50 years old. And as a result, there are ways to think seriously about how to deal with the representation of a very large group of people. And so we do so in classrooms from coast to coast, island to island. And so I think the best practices that the Smithsonian can adopt will involve what Secretary Bunch has pioneered with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, as well as the creation of the National Museum of the American Indian. Both of those institutions represent groups that themselves are incredibly diverse, and themselves have also had to ask very deep questions about the variety, the multiplicity
of those kinds of experiences. I think we'll be taking the same lead, using those institutions as templates, and also relying on the deep research that our academics and public intellectuals and artists can help to provide for us.
Thank you. Ms. Ling, I wanted to turn to you if you're still with us.
I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you. One of the things that I was taken with in listening to you was your all of the wonderful and vivid examples, which you acknowledged were just a handful of the different moments of important contribution and engagement of the Asian American community and population with our country. And you've spoken today and in the past about your own personal experience growing up in Sacramento, the struggles that you felt to identify as a Californian and as an American. But one of the things in listening to you that I was reflecting on is that my children are growing up in a community that is, as I mentioned, home to the third largest API community in the country. And for them as white children to learn more about Asian American history is really an opportunity for them to connect to America. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit, in your journalism, you reach a huge swath of the American population. You're a journalist for all of America. Can you talk a little bit about not just what this museum and the work would mean to Asian Americans, but the opportunity it presents for all Americans to come to a better understanding of our history and a better appreciation of what we need to do going forward to strengthen our country and our respect for each other?
Well, thank you so much, Chair Porter. In fact, I shot an episode of my new show, Takeout, in your very district, and it was an incredible experience, and it was so moving to see how far that community has come, since so many of them and their ancestors came here as refugees during and after the Vietnam War. For me, growing up in a suburb of Sacramento, I watched television all the time because I had working parents, and I never saw anyone who reflected my own experience. I was a huge fan of the Brady Bunch and so many of those kinds of shows, and it was just such a glaring exclusion of Asians in media, in books, in sports, in politics, in all of our institutions. And the opportunity for my own kids and all of our kids, I'm not just talking about the Asian community. I mean, I think it's so important for this country to recognize the discrimination that the Asian community has experienced, but also the extraordinary achievements. And as Mr. Gonzalez pointed out, the stories of the workers and the people who have toiled away to make this country great. And as of now, there are less than a handful of institutions that actually recognize the Asian Pacific American experience. And 0.06% of major art museums showcase any Asian American artists. And when there are no references to a community's inclusion, it becomes so easy to paint an entire people as perpetual foreigners.
Thank you very, very much for that. And thank you for your work and for being here. The chair is now going to recognize Mr. Obernoldy for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Dr. Gonzalez, I'd like to ask some questions about the proposed museum, and I am just a huge fan of the Smithsonian and its mission. I think it's a national treasure, and as a member of Congress, I talk to a lot of constituents that come to DC to visit, and that also see various museums when they're up here, and there isn't a single one that has failed to be inspired when they're here. So very excited about supporting the Smithsonian and its mission. Also excited about the potential for a new museum celebrating the history and the story of the contribution that Asian Americans have made to our rich national history. However, I also am concerned that we do not deter the museum from pursuing its original mission when we go to create new programs and new museums. And in particular, I am concerned about the 2015 Collections Space Framework Plan, which identified the fact that 47% of the Smithsonian collections are currently in inadequate storage space. So I wonder if you could talk for a minute about the Smithsonian's plans for the existing collections, understanding that if we created a new museum, this would be a new collection and would just exacerbate the current problem?
Right. Thank you for the question. I believe Secretary Bunch spoke to this last year before the House Administration Committee. And one of the things that he talked about was one of the level of difficulty of creating new museums. It's not only about pertaining to the new, but it's also addressing the old. Making sure that innovations in the telling of stories, whether through programs, galleries, exhibitions, collections, anything that's added to the collection itself also does not detract from the existing work to address backlogs and whatnot. I'm not prepared today to speak specifically to that, but I do work with a number of professionals in the museum, at the Smithsonian. It's about 6,000 strong, who are dedicated stewards to the public trust. And they take quite seriously the notion that 175 years into this enterprise, the mission of increasing and diffusing knowledge is something that is top of mind for them every day. And that does involve addressing the backlog and the challenges you've identified. It's something that the administration takes quite seriously.
Thank you for the answer, and thank you also for calling attention to the Secretary's testimony in 2019 before the House Administrations Committee. I think that that's a very compelling piece of information, that what he said was, we must not allow the creation of new facilities to impact the Smithsonian's existing mission, which I think is something we all concur with. However, the previous Secretary Sorkin, in 2017 testified before the same House committee and said that he did not believe that the institution could add new museums given its existing workload. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment?
Well, I think Congress has answered the question with the adoption of the two new museums, with the creation of the Smithsonian Women's American History Museum and the National Museum of American and Latino. Both become national priorities, and those are the two major institutional priorities for the institution at the moment. But as well, the other priorities continue to move forward, which is to continue to address the backlog. Again, to be the best stewards that we can with the objects that we have and the stories that we have. And this includes not only Rosie the Riveter, but also the 9/11 stories, to be able to honor ancestors, but also to mark the tragedies that define our histories, to assign gravity to our lives. That's top of mind for 175 years of all of our work.
Great. You just, in your testimony, brought up the current facilities maintenance backlog, which is about $1 billion, I think, right now. Can you talk a little bit about what the institution's plans are for addressing that?
I don't have specific data on that. I could refer some information and provide that to you.
All right, I'd appreciate that. Well, I mean, to frame our discussion here, we're all on the same team. I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm here in Congress for creation of a new museum at the Smithsonian, and certainly something that I support, but I also am supportive of the Smithsonian's existing mission, and I'm hopeful that we could use this discussion as a venue for calling attention to what the needs are of addressing the Smithsonian's existing backlog, and ensuring that our collection storage is adequate for the collections that we already have. And I'm hopeful that maybe we can solve both problems at once. But I want to thank you for your passionate advocacy for the new museum, and I am hopeful that we can work together to get that done. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Orbanotti. The chair will now recognize Representative Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, witnesses, for being here. There's a lot actually on this panel, and giving me a chance to reflect. We had a member, a Gold Star family, a husband. He died in Afghanistan, and she basically mimicked what takes place in New York at the 9/11 Museum, and did it for our local community, and it was amazing. Like, it was one of the neatest things that I've been a part of. So the far-reaching impacts that you have, it's known. I lived a chunk of my life in South Korea and Singapore, spent a lot of time in China. I've lived overseas, and I love the concept of highlighting the contributions that community has made. We recently held a Chamber of Commerce from Utah. Several chambers of commerce came and we were able to get them tickets to the African American Museum, and it was fascinating. It was the first time I had a chance to go through it. So there's good work that's here. I will add a little bit more time just to be able to discuss any backlog that the Smithsonian has. We want these things to be sustainable, and so we want to make sure we're being thoughtful of that. But I know my colleague, Mr. Obelnulty, had discussed it. But one quick question for Mr. Gonzalez. This HR 3525, as it just establishes a commission to study the potential creation of the National Museum, can you speak to the decision-making process that leads to the selection of the site in particular?
Thank you for the question. I am happy to take that up. As a Smithsonian representative, we can't argue for or against the legislation, but the commission process has been serving as a proper template for the creation of other museums, and that also would include site selection as part of its deliberations.
Excellent. And is there a timeline on when that might be done, given the passage of this legislation?
I don't have a timeline.
Okay. Anything else in addition to the backlog that was previously discussed? What are some of the main reasons for backlog that Smithsonian is facing? I'm from Utah. We have a backlog in our national parks as well. It's a major problem. And just any other additional context you'd like to add?
Well, the fact is that the Smithsonian, as I said, 175 years into its history, it has been collecting objects even well before that, and so the maintenance of and the storage of these national treasures is a priority, and so the active collections managers throughout the Smithsonian continue to work as proper stewards of these treasures, to think about the proper housing as well as the maintenance of these collections. So inevitably, any large institution such as the Smithsonian has to deal with these questions, and it becomes part of the responsibility of this particular institution.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to kind of following this as it progresses. Ms. Burlingame, I love that you talked about the love story. I'll never forget when you pick up that phone and you hear Brian and Julie talking, where he says, "Hey, hon, just want to let you know I love you, and I don't know, tell my parents." I mean, it's heartbreaking. Those stories come to life. We have a member of our community that died on one of that's also featured in that 9/11 museum. Couple quick questions. Do you have an estimation of when you expect visitation levels to return to their pre-pandemic levels?
I don't. I have no idea, because these things are out of our control in respect to these new viruses that are coming along, and the changing regulations on the part of our government leaders or civic leaders. We can only respond. We can't predict.
What impact is travel bans, particularly from Europe? What's that had on there, and what projections do you have with anything related to Omicron that might continue to delay this?
Well, Omicron is something that's too new that I don't think a lot of people have a handle on yet. But with respect to travel, I can't answer that. That's something that we could look at, because we have so many visitors at the site who are from overseas. And that's quite interesting to me. It has been from the very beginning that so many people from abroad watch 9/11 live, were affected by it, and care about it, and they come to the site, a lot of them.
Yeah, excellent. Many more questions. I would love to hear about the strategies to fundraise and reduce some of that ticket funding. But overall, very supportive, and thank you for your time. My time's up, so thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Moore. The chair will now recognize Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of you for being here today and for the work that you put into this. Mr. Burlingame, I'm going to have a question for you in just a minute here, but I just want to point out to the committee that back in September, during the markup, Ranking Member Westerman had an amendment that would have removed the highly suspect San Francisco giveaway to Speaker Pelosi's district, the Presidio Park. And it would have redirected those funds to go towards providing grants to the 9/11 memorial. I voted in favor of this amendment, but I'd like to remind everyone here that the 25 Democrats in committee voted against this amendment. They viewed the Presidio Park in San Francisco as more important than the 9/11 memorial. In fact, if you remember back on that day, I believe it was Representative Cohen gave testimony, he said, where the speaker deserves this, as in this Presidio Park giveaway was her personal parting gift, perhaps, here in this session of Congress. And I thought it was entirely inappropriate that someone would say this or that person has worked so hard, therefore they deserve something. It is why the American people are so jaded towards Congress at this point that you would say to somebody, just because you've been speaker, that you deserve to get a $200 million park. Instead of funding the 9/11 memorial, Democrats decided that a personal payout to Pelosi's district was more important. Speaker Pelosi, to be official. It is just another example of where the Democrats' real priorities are. The question I have here, Ms. Burlingame, if you received additional dollars, could you leverage them to more private donations? Is that part of how it works with the 9/11 memorial?
I think the answer is yes. And the reason I would say that is because when people come to the museum, when they can access the material and the programming that more dollars provide, they're inspired and they want to be a part of it. People who are inspired and moved feel good about giving money to an organization that makes their country a better place. And so, yes, I think that's my answer. It's unscientific, but that's my experience.
So I think that I think it's fairly self-evident once lockdowns, shutdowns end, that traffic is going to pick up. Is that correct?
Yes. Oh, sure. Yes.
And do you think it would be substantial?
Well, I would just point to the interest that's happening now virtually, where we have 1 million students on one day, 1,065,000 students that are tuning in. And those are the ones who simply have access because there's an adult who provided it to them. And they loved it. They are talking to people who are now grown-ups who were little kids their age on 9/11, who can really talk to them in a way they understand. So yes, I think it would pick up because the more you know, the more you want to know. And that's our experience.
Yeah, I am very surprised at New York City and the mayor and others, as well as the governor of New York, that have taken really harsh, a very harsh approach to the shutdowns and lockdowns in New York City and New York State at this point. With it's almost like a ready, fire, aim, and this isn't a question to you or anything. You don't have to comment on this. But it's like a ready, fire, aim approach where, by gosh, there's another variant, therefore we're going to institute as harsh a lockdowns as we can. And you wonder why New York City and New York State are being harmed so much. You wonder why people are leaving that state in droves. It's not a lot different than California at this point, while being somewhat similar reasons. But people are going to look for other places to go when you have these continued harsh lockdowns and shutdowns. And it goes to, yes, we all want to curtail COVID. We all want to do what we can, but we cannot be so focused simply on that without considering the impacts that are happening as a result of other actions that are being taken. You hear about the people that are deferring healthcare exams that they should get done, and what is going to be the impact of that, the school shutdowns and the great harm that it's being done to our school or to our children. And it is unfortunate. New York really is not going to allow some institutions, including the 9/11 memorial, it appears, to be able to get back up on their feet. And there's a much better way to go about this, and it's unfortunate New York's taken the approach that it has. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. In closing, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and to all of our members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask that you respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.